So Angus, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's pleasant to be here.
And thank you for being with us today. And well, let me begin by asking you, inequality is one of the main problems, main issues that we are facing today. And even though progress has happened, there is a general sense, I believe, that the world is still hugely unequal. You argue in your new book that inequality is the, quote, handmaiden of progress. So what role did it play in human history, and why does inequality still matter today in the 21st century?
That's a great question, and much of the book is concerned with that. I do say it's the handmaiden of progress, but it's not the only thing I say about inequality. So it's very important that I'm not saying inequality is simply a good thing. It can be a good thing, and it also has a dark side, which I think is extremely dangerous, and it's very dangerous now. So what you say I think is right. I think people are very concerned about inequality. I'm not sure they know what to think about it, and how to think about it. I'm not sure I do either, but maybe I'll give you some idea of how I think about it in the book. You know, one of the causes of inequality in the rich world today is that people with high skills, especially people who can write computer code or do all that sort of stuff, have a much higher salaries relative to people who don't do those things. So there's the gap. And that gap has come about because of technological change in the world. So that creates a big incentive for the people left behind to try to catch up, and shows them that it's possible. They have to go to school, they have to get educated, and we see that all around the world. I mean, more people getting educated in response to that. So that's the good side of it. It acts as an incentive. It shows the way, it acts as an incentive. But of course, bad things sometimes happen too. So again, to go back to the prisoner of war camp, you can imagine if the people who'd escaped filled in the tunnels behind them and said, you know, we're going to prevent anyone else coming after us because we want to get a clean getaway. And that happens in economic life too, that people, you know, who've made great inventions then are very careful to protect their profits and their position by trying to stop competitors coming along behind them. So that's one of the negative sides of inequality. But, you know, inequality is part of incentives, it's part of the economic structure, it's the way the economy works, it's the way that markets work. Some people get fabulously rich out of this process, and they can misuse their wealth in various ways. So one thing you have to worry about a lot, I think, is that if rich people use their money to get political control, and so economic inequality turns into political inequality. And, you know, those of us who believe in democracy, which is a very large share of the world, feel that, you know, one person, one vote is an important part of that. It's not $1, one vote, or €1, one vote. It's a sense that everybody's equal before democracy. And if you feel you can't participate because everything is being run for the rich, that's a real cost. And so that's having very rich people and very poor people. They don't participate equally in society. And it may be voting, it may be all sorts of other things, and that's potentially problematic. And Louis Brandeis said many, many years ago, it's not clear that democracy can coexist with extreme inequality. So that's sort of the thing that you're really worried about.
In your book, you make perfectly clear that progress in health has been as impressive as progress in wealth. It's an important point, and yet health inequalities are one of the great injustices of the world today. Why do, despite new inventions, which you mentioned, and new treatments, do these inequalities still persist? And yeah, well, what can be done about them in the end?
I worry about health inequalities less than I worry about income inequalities, because if you get healthier than me, it doesn't enable you to take over the government and oppress me. So that dimension is missing. But I do worry about parts of it. So for instance, some of health inequality, I think, is due to unequal treatment between different groups. for instance. So, for instance, in the United States, African Americans have shorter lives than white Americans. And I think, not everybody agrees with this, but I think quite a lot of that is due to the fact that the hospitals that treat mostly black patients are much worse resourced, have lower quality staff than the hospitals that treat mostly white patients. And I think that is an injustice, and we should do something about it. But, you have to judge these case by case. I mean, women live a lot longer than men, all right? And we don't think, that that's an injustice, or maybe it is. Some people do think it's an injustice. I don't think so much it's an injustice, though injustice is involved in it. I mean, the lifespan is now getting closer to men, and some of that is because of cigarette smoking, and some of that is to do with the fact that for many years women were not encouraged to smoke. So I think with health you have to think it through case by case. And once again, I don't think it's an injustice if new techniques come along and the rich people get them first, because after a while they'll spread to everybody. And you wouldn't want to stop those new techniques just because they cause inequality, because what you're hoping is everybody will get them.
You're right, economic growth is the engine of escape from poverty and material deprivation. Yet growth, it seems, is faltering in the rich world. What exactly is required to generate growth and wealth? And I believe what are the key forces leading to improvements in human well-being or even happiness?
I think economists have studied economic growth for a really, really long time. I mean, in some sense, the central question of economics. And I think they made very, very little progress with it. We know some things that are very bad for growth, like communism isn't such a good way of running an economy. Very, very high taxes seem not to work. But even if you set conditions, ideally, to everything we know, some countries are going to grow and some countries are not going to grow, and some periods are going to grow and some periods not. In the long run, I think, the great economist Robert Solow had this understanding that what was really driving economic growth in the end was new ideas, technical progress, not machines, not investment, but new ideas. And it's new ideas that make the difference. And we have new ways of doing things, and we have new realizations. And those new ideas are coming to people all the time. Some people think of it just, the isolated scientist is sitting in his room and, light comes on from heaven and says, here's an idea. But I think they're more to do with, something bad is happening and people say, how do we deal with this? Or people are presented with problems and challenges. Like the germ theory of disease, I think would probably not have been solved when it was understood without the cholera epidemics in Europe in the 19th century, and Koch in Germany, and Pasteur in France, and Snow in England, all dealt with cholera and tried to find an understanding of cholera. So you get these periods when these innovations are coming along and being put into place, and we get a lot of economic growth. And then there are periods when we think there ought to be a lot of economic growth and there isn't any. So, some people, Bob Gordon most recently has been arguing that we've run out of all the good ideas, and the good ideas have all been thought up, and there are no more good, and I just don't believe that. The world is, I think, getting a better place in these other dimensions too. Many girls are being educated around the world that didn't used to be educated. There's much more democracy in the world. People are much freer to practice their religion than has been true probably for a long time. Even things like caste systems in India are weaker than they used to be. We don't mistreat women in the way we used to. We don't mistreat homosexuals in the way that we used to. Minorities are much more respected. None of it is perfect, but there's been a lot of progress. And Amartya Sen has argued over the years that each of these components of human freedom helps the other. So that economic growth helps democracy, democracy helps economic growth. I mean, I'm not sure he's right on all of those connections, but it's a very attractive idea, and it's clear that parts of it are certainly true.
Yeah, Professor Deaton, almost 1 billion people or so still live in destitution and in abject poverty. And rich countries try to help, of course, by using foreign aid. You, and I believe somewhat provocatively, claim that foreign aid does more harm than good. But what else can be done to help those who are left behind?
So the question of, there are, as you say, a bit less than $1 billion. A bit less than 1 billion people who are living in terrible destitution. And first we should note that there's been huge progress in that. So in 1980, there were perhaps 2 billion people living under those things. So that change from 2 billion to 1 billion is probably one of the greatest feats that mankind has ever achieved. If you look at why that's happened, much of it has come from economic growth, and economic growth in what were previously very poor countries, and especially very poor countries that have a lot of people in them, and most notably India and China. That's a lot to do with globalization. Globalization has its critics, and it has a bad side, but no one should talk about globalization without recognizing the extraordinary effect on reducing poverty. So I know I'm not quite answering your question about foreign aid, but of course, if you say, well, what role did foreign aid play in getting those 1 billion people out of poverty? The answer is almost none, if only because in India and China, where much of this has come from, foreign aid was an absolutely tiny part of the economy, just because those economies are huge and foreign aid is not all that large. The countries that got a lot of foreign aid relative to their GDP or relative to government expenditure are in Africa. And, they didn't do so well. And I argue in the book that there are good reasons for that. And I think large flows of aid from abroad into countries where the aid is a huge share of government expenditure, for instance, mean that the government stops paying any attention to its own people and pays attention only to the aid and to the people who are giving the aid. And so it's sort of like you're buying these people, and they don't have to respond to their own people anymore. So the bit of foreign aid I'm against is large flows into countries from outside. Okay, but you say, well, does that mean we give up on those people? Well, of course we don't give up on these people, and we have a moral responsibility to help these people to the extent we can. We also have a moral responsibility not to hurt them, which is, some of what we're doing. So again, if you think in the past, what have we done? What has the rich world done for Africa? I mentioned the germ theory of disease before. I mean, the germ theory of disease has brought longer life expectancy to incredible numbers of people in Africa, even in countries where there's not been much economic growth. And so technical innovation in health, for instance, or even in things, cell phones have taken over Africa. Well, cell phones are innovations that came from the rich world, but had applications in there. So anything we can do to encourage technological improvements that work in poor countries are going to help make poor countries better off. The other thing we're doing is we're doing things to hurt them, right? We like to export arms to the same countries that we're giving aid to. So why exactly do we think we're doing that? I mean, we give this money in aid, and then we take it all away again by sending guns to those places. Maybe we're giving the money to make up for sending the guns, or I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. We also have trade restrictions, which make it very difficult for farmers in Africa to sell things in the United States and in the EU. So, there's lots of stuff we can do, and we certainly don't have to sit on our hands and say, I'm sorry, the only way we can help you is by leaving you alone. And so that's the sort of thing I tell my students. I mean, the other thing I tell my students is, I have a friend who was a Belgian citizen. His name is Jahrhundert, and he has spent his life working in India. And he gave up his Belgian citizenship in order to become an Indian citizen, which is a very hard thing to do. He's an activist in India. He works with local NGOs and groups. He will take no money from abroad. He agitates, he causes trouble. and he tries to make India a better place. And he and his collaborators have been incredibly successful. Not everybody likes what he does, but he's helped introduce free school lunches for children in India. He's helped introduce a food for work scheme so that people get work when they don't have a minimum wage. But he did not do that from outside. So, when I get students in Princeton who come and say, I'd really like to help in Rwanda, what should I do? I say, well, go to Rwanda, marry a Rwandan coffee farmer, and settle there and try to make Rwanda a better place from the inside. It's just that you can't make someone else's country better off from the outside. That's sort of a little too like colonialism for my taste.
Well, whilst we are talking, millions of people worldwide try to escape from poverty, death and civil war. And whereas our Chancellor Angela Merkel felt a kind of moral obligation to help and to let immigrants in, other leading European politicians, but not only European ones, prefer obviously to build walls or even shut the doors behind them. What kind of politics of migration do you favor in this respect?
I'm always reluctant to, I just talked about developing other people's countries from the outside. Who am I as a British or American citizen to come and tell Germans or Hungarians or Poles, what they should do about this crisis? So, like most people around the world, I'm enormously admiring of Angela Merkel for this very brave humanitarian position that she's taken. But like everybody else, I understand the political risks involved in doing that. And immigration is something that scares people a lot, probably unnecessarily. We talked earlier today about how the people who are most scared of immigrants are the people who don't know immigrants. And it's sort of like people are afraid of something they don't know. And when they see immigrants close up, they realize they're people like they are, and they can integrate themselves. So I think there are policies that can make it work, especially if local communities are involved and people. And I know Germany's had a lot of experience in trying to do this. But, to come from Britain where, we, or my countrymen, recently voted for Brexit, partly over this immigration issue, where the America has promised to take a tiny number and has only admitted a tiny fraction of those tiny numbers, and where there's an election going on in which disgraceful talk about immigration is going on. I'm not sure I have much standing to speak on this, and obviously, it's very easy for liberal intellectuals to get up and tell politicians that this is shameful what you're doing, but they have real political constraints, and I don't know what you do about this in the long run. I should maybe point out that from the point of view of inequality, the global inequality in the world is part of the reason why this happens, because if there's a civil war in your country, you don't go off to another country in Africa or another country in the Middle East. You head for Germany or Britain or France or somewhere in the rich world. And it's that long-standing inequality that creates the potential for this to happen. So one thing one can think about is that, I don't know how you might do this, but if we lived in a more equal world, those pressures would be much less intense. And that's what people have said, of course, all along with the Syrian issue. The solution lies in Syria. The solution doesn't really lie in Germany or Hungary. And of course, that's been very hard to come by because of the difficulty of what's going on there.
Well, finally, I'd like to look at the future. The past 250 years have seen unprecedented progress, yet there is nothing to say that it will continue forever, of course. And, well, I would like to ask you, what comes next? What are the main threats or even the main challenges that lie ahead? Do we have reason to be at least mildly optimistic?
I think we do, but first of all, I think it's very important that there's several parts of this story that people I don't think know very well, and it's good for them to know. First is that we live in a very uncertain, difficult world right now, And the newspapers always report bad news, and they don't say, there's no headline that says life expectancy has increased 5 times since 1500 or something. You just don't get that in the newspaper. So this story that there has been a huge amount of progress. So we could be living in a very dangerous time right now, and simultaneously it'd be true that this is the best time there's ever been on Earth. So seeing that, I think, is very important when you look forward, because if you're conscious of all that progress, you think maybe we can do more of it. So that's an important thing to realize. But then, of course, the other part that you just put in the question, just because we've had 250 years of progress does not mean that it goes on before. And many people, I think, have gotten used to the idea of this perpetual economic growth, that the world will get better, though maybe recently they're not quite so used to it. So some of the threats are, we talked at the beginning about inequality. So extreme inequality that undermines democratic progress, so that you get large groups of people left behind, is going to be very dangerous for us all. And I think in the United States, people have been left behind and they're voting for Donald Trump. In France, they have Marine Le Pen. In Britain, there's Brexit. Everywhere there's a sense that, politics as usual is leaving large groups behind, and those groups are angry. Of course, the danger is that their remedies will break important parts of what we have. Maybe the EU doesn't work very well. Maybe it's not as democratic as it should be. But the EU has delivered enormous benefits to people since the Second World War, and we don't want to get rid of it. We don't want to break it just because the last few steps were not such great steps. So I think the inequality, the political threat, leaving people behind, the political threat that comes from that, first of all, it's bad to leave people behind, but it's bad for the rest of us if those people left behind start breaking things. Climate change is not something we've talked about, but it's clearly enormously important. I don't write much about it in the book, simply because there are other people who know a lot more about it than I do, and I leave it to them. But I do want to make it clear that for me, I see that as an enormous threat. I mean, we talk about our children, we're better off than our grandparents. We'd also like our grandchildren to be better off than we are, and that's not going to happen if we destroy the planet or we flood it. So I think that's a huge danger. There's always the danger of just toxic politics. There's wars, there's crazy politicians. And I think some of that is independent of economic forces and so on. You don't have to have a totally Marxist view of the world. Maniacs come along and do bad things. And those can do terrible setbacks. There are perhaps more mundane things like antibiotic resistance. I write a little bit about it in the book. We're running out of new antibiotics. And if you can imagine a world in which you get a cut and it threatens your life, it would make lots of surgeries impossible. There's lots of things we depend on, which really depend on that. We talked about immigration before, or migration, which is another threat to politics and to people. So, if you list all these things and you read the newspapers on a daily basis, you might think there really isn't much of a future, and maybe that 250 years has come to an end. And, there have been cases in the past where there were great escapes that came to an end. There were very rich places in China in the 11th century. There were places in Africa, there were places where it looked like they'd really got it together, and somehow they stopped. So it can certainly come to an end. But the reason I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm much more optimistic if you ask 30 years, a longer period ahead, is because these deep forces of human ingenuity, of human creativity, of wanting to be better off, wanting our children to be better off, those are not going to go away anytime soon. And they've been constant in human history. And you might say, well, they were constant in human history in 900 AD, so why didn't they grow? Well, they didn't know how to. And we know a lot. And even if you destroyed so much of the stuff around us, the capital, the human capital, the institutions, you couldn't destroy the knowledge that those things had once been there. So, you know, if bad things happen to the world, it would certainly take time to bring it back, but I'm sort of optimistic that it would be possible to do so. So I hope we will not have a catastrophe, and that what we're going through now will just seem like a dip, like dips we've had before. But, you know, bad times will come for sure, but I think I'm optimistic that we can dig ourselves out. You know, a simple summary of what we've been talking about, I think, is that the world is just a way better place than it used to be. And it's much better in many dimensions. People live longer, they're richer, and democracy's better. I could have a long list. So there has been a great escape from poverty and deprivation of humankind over the last 250 years. Not everybody's made it. The escape has caused a lot of inequality too. That inequality is a good thing as part of economic incentives, but it's also a very dangerous thing. So I've often said, I love inequality, but I'm terrified of it. And that's one of the threats we face as we move into the future.